It's River to River from IPR News. I'm Ben Kiefer. There are Iowans listening to this program right now who arrived in this state as infants on a flight from Korea, carrying paperwork that may not have been true. Between the 1950s and the 2000s, more than 200,000 Korean children were sent overseas for adoption. Well over half came to the U.S., and Iowa was among the largest receiving states in the country. The great majority of those adoptions ran through a single agency, founded in 1955 by an Oregon farm couple named Harry and Bertha Holt. In fact, Bertha was raised outside Des Moines. She trained as a nurse at the University of Iowa. Neither Bertha nor Harry had any background in child welfare. Now, Oregon's Welfare Division assessed them and concluded in writing that they were sincere but misguided. A U.S. senator wrote them a private bill anyway, and what they built became the template for modern international adoption. 4 of those children from Korea came to the Sueppel family of Iowa City between 1998 and 2005. In March of 2008, Steve Sueppel, a bank executive facing federal embezzlement charges, killed his wife, Cheryl, and all 4 of their children, and then himself. Many of you will remember that week in 2008. I certainly do. My guest today was a University of Iowa senior when it happened. Paige Towers grew up in Iowa City. She spent 6 years reconstructing what came before those deaths through archives, letters, court records, and more than 30 interviews. Her new book from the University of Iowa Press is titled What They Stole. It follows the Holt Agency from a farmhouse in Cresswell, Oregon, to the courts of Seoul, where this history is still being litigated, and also back to a house a few miles from where Paige grew up. I spoke with her last week. Paige Towers, welcome to our program.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
What a tremendously well-researched book and intense, of course, we can gather from the content here. Let's start with your personal connection and background, if we could. You're from Iowa City. A year after the Sueppel murders, you moved to South Korea to teach English. But let's first of all go to when you were a University of Iowa senior in the spring of 2008, when the Sueppel murder case broke in your hometown. What do you remember about how the community absorbed it at the time?
Right. So it was obviously a shocking and traumatizing event for the whole community. I did not know the Sueppels personally, although Iowa City can feel like such a small community, and I probably had about 20 social connections to them. I saw them around town occasionally. Obviously, I was horrified by the event. But it really, like you said, when I went to South Korea the following year, 2009, it wasn't until then that I had second thoughts about adoption there. I was confused as to why this modern, very economically booming country was still sending children to the West. So this question lingered with me for a while, as did those murders. They would pop up, I think, as they do for a lot of people, they would pop up in my head occasionally. But it really wasn't until it was 2019. I was living in Milwaukee, and I woke up one morning and it occurred to me that I'd never searched up the Sueppel case. And I sat down and started Googling, and very quickly I was led into Reddit threads and other things, just other pieces written by adopted people, activists, journalists. And I discovered that there is this much more complicated, traumatic past to the history of Korean adoption that I had no idea about. And very quickly, within 2 weeks, I just sort of felt like, I think there's a story here, and I think I can possibly do it. I feel like I could use this horrible tragedy in Iowa City and use it as a lens into this much bigger pattern.
And so that was the point, Paige, that it sounds like you realized it wasn't just, if I can say that, it wasn't a true crime story you were writing. It was much bigger than that.
Right. Yes, I never set out to write a true crime book. I wanted, I felt by focusing on this one Sueppel case, as painful as it is, and as the grief and horror that the friends and family of the Sueppel they're still experiencing is horrific and unimaginable. But I felt by focusing on one case, I could make these larger issues about intercountry adoption feel real and immediate rather than abstract.
I'd like to ask you to read a passage from early on in your book, Chapter 4, where Bertha is at the University of Iowa. And it goes a long way to explaining how and why you intertwine these two stories. She's 16 years old, canoeing on the Iowa River with what is called the Cosmopolitan Club. Set that up for us and read it, please.
As you said earlier, the Holts are from the Midwest. Originally, Bertha grew up outside of Des Moines, and they were actually first cousins. And so, yeah, I found this to be a really interesting connection right away, that Bertha was at University of Iowa, and I felt like it was a good way to connect the Holts to the Sueppels immediately for the reader. And so in this chapter, we have a very young Bertha Holt at University of Iowa. In the fall of 1920, after graduating in the top of her class at Des Moines East High School, a 16-year-old Bertha enrolled in a 5-year combined bachelor's and nursing degree program at the University of Iowa, which amounted to 3 years of studies in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, followed by 2 years of training at the University of Iowa Hospital. Her cousin Harry, meanwhile, dropped out of school by the 8th grade to help on the family farm. In Iowa City, once her 12-hour nursing shift started, Bertha hauled a clunky alarm clock around campus so she could nap in the hospital's attic between classes. As a freshman, though, her limited free time wasn't just devoted to sleep. On warm days, she and other members of the university's Cosmopolitan Club rented canoes and paddled up and down the slow-moving Iowa River, navigating past what was still natural grasslands and woods just north of the city. Not for a moment had Bertha considered participating in any stereotypical college, quote, doohickeys, her all-encompassing term for parties, drinking, or just general immoral behavior. Belonging to the Plymouth Brethren meant that youthful diversions like dating or dancing were sins that could lead to years of banishment. But the activities of the Cosmopolitan Club, where study abroad students socialize with their American peers, wouldn't get her ostracized from her religious community so long as she didn't break bread with any outsiders. Quote, "Isn't it odd that I turned out to be kind of interested in that and then adopted children from Korea?" End quote. Bertha said during an interview decades later, referring to the club's cross-cultural aims. Once the canoes were stored and farewells exchanged, Bertha marched past the university's neoclassical stone buildings, her antiquated long dress and braids contrasting with the bobbed hair of other passing young women. Residing in a mansion on Iowa City's southeast side, Bertha received room and board in exchange for 4 hours of housework a day. In the evening, she climbed a narrow servant's staircase accessible from the kitchen that led to a snug attic room. After growing up with 8 siblings, having her own space, her own bed and desk and chair was exciting, like living in a little corner of a castle. While her cousin and soon-to-be husband, Harry, labored on a wheat and chicken farm, she studied anatomy, physiology, and materia medica into the late hours, pausing occasionally to look out her window. Through the trees, Bertha could glimpse a 3-story brick school built in 1817, standing adjacent to a field often blanketed with fog. Named after the poet and educator Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, this was Longfellow Elementary, where the adopted Sueppel children would attend school some 80 years later.
Paige Towers reading from her book, What They Stole, follows the Holt Adoption Agency from its founding by an evangelical farm family in 1955 to the lawsuits it faces today. Paige, we have about a minute before we take a break. I'd like you, if you can, in that, to introduce us to Harry and Bertha Holt and how they got connected with adoption. It has to do with a 1954 presentation when Bob Pierce of World Vision showed films of Korean children. Introduce us to that connection.
Right. So Harry and Bertha Holt had resettled in Cresswell, Oregon. They became very successful loggers. They started a farm. They had many businesses, a sawmill. They became millionaires. And in 1954, World Vision, as you said, run by Bob Pierce, he held a event in Eugene where he was presenting films and just a fundraising pitch about the need for care for funds in post-war South Korea. There was a small population of multiracial Korean children who'd been fathered by American GIs in the region. And post-war South Korea, this was a deeply devastated country with no social welfare safety net whatsoever, a total lack of housing, a food shortage. And so there was a great deal of suffering and a great need for charitable contributions. But Harry and Bertha Holt, upon seeing these films and hearing Bob Pierce speak, they took this back to their own church. They belonged to an evangelical church in the region. And very quickly, they decided on their own mission. Instead of just contributing funds to World Vision, they decided that they had been called upon God to adopt 8 multiracial children from Korea.
Paige, we have to take a break. We'll be right back to pick up the story. Author Paige Towers, her new book is called What They Stole. It's River to River from IPR News. Back with more River to River from IPR News. I'm Ben Kiefer. Let's get back to more of my recent conversation with Paige Towers, Iowa City native. She spent 6 years tracing a 2008 tragedy in her own hometown of Iowa City back to the founding of modern Korean adoption. Her new book is titled What They Stole. Paige, before the break, you were connecting the Sueppels with, they had just begun their mission because of a 1954 presentation by Bob Pierce of World Vision. Continue with that narrative.
Right. So, as you mentioned earlier, they managed to have an Oregon senator write them a special Holt bill because at the time, American couples were only allowed to adopt a maximum of two children from overseas, unless that meant splitting up multiple siblings. So they received this special act that they could adopt 8 children. Harry flew to South Korea. He'd never left the country before. He collected, in his words, he collected 8 children from different orphanages across the country. When he eventually flew home with these 8 children, it was a huge media sensation. The story was covered in Life and Look magazine and the New York Times, everywhere across the country. And with all of this national attention, the Holts very quickly decided, with the support of their church, that they were going to launch an adoption agency.
Mm-hmm. Go into that, because they could have worked within what was existing international adoption there. But in your book, Harry described social workers and child welfare agencies as the establishment, even conspiring against him. How much did that adversarial posture trigger the establishment of the Holt, their own Holt entity, and become permanent in that agency's culture, that hostility?
Right. So the Holts were deeply conservative. They were anti-federalist. They, like before adoption, their cause really was they were anti-union, anti-federal tax, anti-state. And so I think what a lot of people, and certainly myself, I did not know that there were a lot of established norms around intercountry adoptions before the Holtz moved into that space. So, um, intercountry adoption was still relatively rare. It was mostly undergone by families working overseas, ambassadors, and the like. Um, and when children from post-war countries were sent to the West, it was done first. The children recuperated in hospitals or in foster homes in their country. There was no more than 8 children sent at a time. And of course, American adoptive families were well screened beforehand, interviewed, background checks, educated about adoption. But the Holtz came in and rejected all of these norms. They decided that they did not want any regulation whatsoever, and they managed to do this by circumventing the system. Uh, they established what is known as adoption by proxy, where adoptive parents an adoption was completed in the country, in Korea, by an agent, and then American parents picked up their children stateside. So um, the Holtz, their agency was radical and highly unorthodox. And these families that were adopting Korean children, they did not undergo background checks, as I said. They didn't receive any screening whatsoever by social workers. There were no financial requirements. And a lot of them turned to the Holtz because they had been rejected by their state welfare department for whatever reasons, ranging from mental health issues to alcoholism or to um, age. The Holtz themselves were in their 50s when they adopted 8 children. They already had 6 biological children. So yeah, it was just this brand new Wild West of adoption.
And Paige, back to the filtering or the lack of filtering. In your book, you say that the original Holt adoption application was a single index card. The key question was whether the applicant was a born again Christian. So that was the only thing that mattered to them.
Right. Yes. Yeah, it was a single note card. And all that mattered was that a person was, in their words, was saved. And so if you were not a born again Christian, for instance, if you were Methodist or Lutheran, your application was rejected. The Holtz, in their own writings, frequently said that their mission was not to save the children of Korea, but to save the souls of the children of Korea.
Hmm. Okay. Take us to the growth of this Holt adoption agency here. How fast did it grow? When would you say it reached its apex?
So they launched in 1956 formally. And again, nothing comparable had been done before. So not only were they enabled and supported by lawmakers in the US, but they were receiving immense support from the South Korean government. This was a conservative, semi-authoritarian government who saw multiracial children as a threat to established social norms. And it was also about the money. This is a post-war suffering country, and the Korean government saw the Holtz as a way to not only did they need to spend the billions of won to build a social welfare system, but also suddenly the country's being flooded by all of these American dollars coming in to pay fees for children. And so very quickly, the Holtz start running what they deem baby lifts. So if that earlier norm is no more than 8 children being transported at a time on a commercial flight, the Holtz decided to disregard that, and they started using these old Korean national airline planes that had been used in the war. These were not pressurized planes. And what they did was that they removed the seats in the planes, and that way they could store babies in boxes and around 100 children at a time, and transport them back. And these were 3 day long flights, multiple legs, extremely treacherous flights. And as I wrote about in the book, not all children survived them. But very quickly through that, as you can imagine, these records are hard to access. So a lot of the times I was relying on US media reports, but um, very quickly it's hundreds and hundreds of children, and then it's thousands of children by 1958 that have been transported to the US.
That's just breathtaking. I want to focus on, the Korean side of this, who the Korean mothers were in this story. And your book documents police in Korea used to take children in camp towns, payments made to orphanage directors. So the line here between coercion versus what we would call trafficking here, because you have one woman saying when she encountered these people, she thought, they said, "Oh, what a beautiful baby," and she thought they just wanted to hold the baby, when in fact they took her baby and drove off with it.
Mhm. Yes, this this history it's awful. It's so harmful. And as you can imagine, I would have to step back and take breaks, take dog walks while reading through this. It is also still very hidden. And there are some researchers, academics out there who are trying to preserve more stories from Korean birth mothers, from Korean biological families about what was going on. On my end, it was a lot of research trying to connect the Holts to all of these instances of bribery and coercion and kidnappings. And a lot of that is still concealed within their own records. A lot of that is still sort of hidden under this very sanitized language. But what I discovered, and what other academics have discovered before me, is that the Holts were going into these child centers. And again, what's happening here is there's no social welfare system. There's no housing support. There's no food pantries. And so there's no childcare. So what's happening is that Korean women were taking their children to orphanages, and they had agreements with the directors there that their children could stay for 3 days or 3 months. And there they're receiving 2 or 3 meals a day, powdered milk, vegetables, rice. And the orphanage directors are receiving income from the state for the number of children in their care. And the women could go out and work and try to earn and save a little bit of money to be able to feed their children. And then they'd come back and collect their child. The Holts took advantage of this, and would go into these orphanages and they would pay the directors a fee to take children. So when the mothers showed up to bring home their child, they discovered that they were gone. They didn't know where they'd gone, and they were gone forever. And as you said too, the Holts were working with the police. This was really hard to uncover because there's just a few mentions of it within the Holt's own writing, or employees of the Holt's own writing. And in the media, I found that this was referred to as a census, that the Korean police were going out and like as if they were going out and just counting the number of multiracial children. But in fact, I found that Harry, and with the help of Korean police, were actually taking some of those children. As you said, a lot of those were through coercion. A lot of them were kidnappings.
Hmm. Talk a little bit about the mixed race children, because there are two narratives here running against each other. That mixed race children were discriminated against in Korea. That was given as a motive to remove them. But also, you found evidence that mixed race children were being accepted in Korean villages, and that mothers were increasingly reluctant to give them up.
Right. Yes. So this was not a first to Korea. Wherever U.S. soldiers had gone, they were leaving behind multiracial children. Most notably, like a good comparison is in Japan, that post-war had a large population of multiracial children, and child welfare NGOs that working in that region had found that through support for single mothers, with social welfare, with a changing of the rhetoric, that they were able to keep children and mothers together, or in the very least find foster families for these children, or keep them in domestic centers. But in Korea, this during the war, there was a very thin line between the U.S. military and Korean children. So they were on the ground, and there became this Sujin Pate, an academic and writer. She coined this term military humanitarianism. And so U.S. soldiers during the Korean War were funding and creating all of these orphanages. They themselves started to adopt Korean children and brought them home, back to America with a lot of fanfare. But ultimately, when the war ended in 1853, of course, there were still U.S. soldiers on the ground, but there were a substantial number of multiracial children left behind. That number is unclear, whether it's an estimated 500 or 1,500, in 1953, 1954, 1955. It's really unclear. But it became kind of this talking point for this very nationalistic, authoritarian Korean government, as if these children were not pure, they were not real Koreans, especially children who were Korean Black. But then, as you said, there was also a lot of evidence that children were being accepted, and that there were child centers full of children who were quote unquote pure Korean, and also children who were multiracial, living happily amongst each other. And so there was definitely the argument that with social change and with education and with more support for single mothers, that there could have been a shift, and that these children could have certainly remained with their mothers, and that society would have shifted around them.
We have a couple minutes before a break. Paige Towers, my guest. What They Stole follows the Holt Adoption Agency from its founding to the lawsuits today, and an Iowa City family who adopted 4 Korean children through Holt and died in 2008 at the father's hands. Let's make that connection now. We've talked a lot about Holt. Let's make the connection. Let's say 1998, the Holt Guidebook. This is the year that the Sueppels adopted their first child. This agency still stated that its desire that these children go into Christian homes so they would come to know Jesus. You said before, their aim was to have the children's souls saved. Tell us about the connection here to the Sueppels. Devout, generous, without a doubt, prayed at dinner, gave to every fundraiser that came their way. They adopted these 4 children in Iowa City. Pick that up here before we go to break, and then we'll continue afterwards.
Stephen and Cheryl Sueppel first adopted a child through Holt in 1998. And in 1998, adoption had dwindled slightly, but it still kind of carried the same rhetoric as before. It was seen as this act of rescue. It was seen as a good deed, almost as a charitable deed. And I would argue that the Holts seemingly were an ideal adoptive family according to the standards that the Holt Agency had set. They were white, they were religious, they were well established in their community, and had a nice suburban home. They both worked at the time.
Paige, we have to take another break. We'll be back with more of my conversation with author Paige Towers. She has a new book out that examines an adoption agency that for years screened prospective parents primarily on whether they were born-again Christians, including the Iowa City family at the center of her book, the Sueppels. They passed every check the agency had, And we'll be back with more of my conversation with Paige Towers about her book, What They Stole. It's River to River from IPR News. Back with more River to River from IPR News. I'm Ben Kiefer. Paige Towers, my guest, an Iowa City native. She spent 6 years tracing a 2008 tragedy many of you will remember in Iowa City, tracing it back to the founding of a modern Korean adoption agency. Her new book is titled What They Stole, Familicide Rooted in Intercountry Adoption. It's part investigative history, part true crime, part reckoning with faith, an account of how one Oregon couple's adoption agency reshaped hundreds of thousands of lives, including, in the end, lives and tragedies in her hometown of Iowa City. Paige, let's pick this up here and, have you tell us that, sort of on paper, the Sueppels were exactly the kind of family this agency had been built to find. Take us from that screening that seemed to work perfectly for this Holt agency to the outcome, which was obviously catastrophic.
Right. So the Holts adopted in 1998, 1999, 2002, 2005. And as I discovered through my research, the Holt agency still at this time did not have very many financial requirements. Later, the South Korean government, through investigations, found their screenings of families to be wanting in many regards. But what happened was that in 2007, Stephen Sueppel either was fired or left his job at Hills Bank after they discovered that he allegedly had embezzled and money laundered a very significant sum. An investigation started, led by the FBI. During this time, Eleanor, their youngest adopted daughter, who was only 2 years old at the time, her adoption still had not been finalized. That was a step taken by the state, where a judge would have to look at all of the agency's paperwork, all of their home studies, and if the agency, if everyone declared that it was in the best interest that this adoption be finalized, that this is good for the child, then that paperwork was stamped, and then Eleanor would be their child. So this is happening while Steve is now under criminal investigation. Their lives are very quickly falling apart. I spoke to Cheryl's brother and some of her best friends to try to get a picture of what was happening during this time and what Cheryl's thinking was. I deeply appreciate those people for going back and revisiting that time right before their death, because it gave me really an insight into what the thinking was and what some of the other possibilities could have been. But then, of course, before his trial started, Steve made a very different choice.
Right. And a judge in Johnson County finalized that fourth adoption that you mentioned in December of 2007. Months into this federal criminal investigation of Stephen Sueppel, you interviewed a longtime Iowa City family attorney who can't understand what happened. So he's under federal criminal investigation. They're waiting to, and yet this adoption gets finalized. What did that law attorney tell you about who was supposed to catch that and what happened, presumably?
A lot of these finalizations relied on these private Christian agencies, in this case, the Holt Agency, looking at their paperwork. So the Holt Agency, of course, was responsible for finding the children, for finding the families, for screening the families, and then doing all of these post-adoption studies. And so a judge sitting in the county would have been looking through all of this paperwork from the Holt Agency that said, this family is good to go. So I, as a researcher, I'm not able to access any of that paperwork. It's all confidential. So I'm not sure if the judge would have had reports from the whole agency saying, this father has uh, lost his job. He was the sole provider of the family, so temporarily they lost their entire income. And also, he's facing multiple years in a federal prison. Whether a judge looked at that or not is still unclear. The family law attorney that I spoke to felt very strongly that the judge would have known, and certainly the family law attorney processing processing these adoptions would have known, and felt that multiple steps had been missed, that there was some neglect there. And so it was an interesting puzzle piece to put together. One more thing where it was like there was not a fail safe where there should have been.
I wanted to talk what's obviously missing in this book, and despite your 6 years of pursuing this story and covering, well, dozens of interviews, but also all the archives you looked into, the Sueppel family did not consent to interviews. Obviously, one cannot think of a more painful episode in an extended family. Tell us about that process, how you approached them, what you asked for, and how those conversations went.
I was very aware of how deeply sensitive this subject was. And this was one of the hardest things of writing the book, of researching, was how do I approach people without re-traumatizing? And I did try to explain in the emails that I wrote, I tried to explain that I was approaching this as sensitively as I could, and that this was not a salacious true crime story, but rather I just wanted to tell the story of these children's lives. I wanted to tell the story of Cheryl's life. Um, but yeah, I did not receive a response, or in a couple of cases, I received just a very direct but polite no thank you. And I wasn't surprised. I understand why a family would not want to speak about this tragedy. It's horrific. I imagine the feelings are incredibly complicated. Um, and to have a journalist come in and now write about the case, I know that's deeply intrusive. I know that this is just a reality of journalism, is that I, as the journalist, can come in and tell this story, but I know it's deeply personal to other people.
Really sounds, Paige, like you really struggled here, and I understand.
Mhm.
You've explained that struggle well. I want to remind our listeners that we're listening to a conversation with Paige Towers about her new book, What They Stole. Begins with the 2008 murders of the Sueppel family in Iowa City. These are four children adopted from South Korea, killed along with their mother by their adoptive father, and traces that back through 70 years of Korean adoption history. Before the hour is up, Paige, I wanted to make sure we touched on a couple of things. In March of 2025, South Korea's Truth and Reconciliation Commission concluded that the government bore responsibility for a foreign adoption program, quote, rife with fraud and abuse. What did the report establish? What did it stop short of? Where are we right now as we talk in 2026?
Right. So the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, as of 2026, is still continuing. They're 3 years in, and they keep accepting more and more cases from adopted people um, who claim that their paperwork is fraudulent, or that they were kidnapped, or they were abused by their adoptive families, or a series of fraudulent behavior. Um, right now, there is this huge reckoning happening with intercountry adoption, particularly from Korea. Korea is historically the largest sending country in the world. Um, and right now, the committee is mostly focused on the period of time in the 1980s, which is, so you have all of this medical neglect and all of this coercion and kidnappings happening in the 1950s. but this doesn't end. In fact, by the 1980s, the system has become the system that the Holts have largely built has become even more treacherous. There's very little regulation, and there are four different agencies working in the region, all of them trying to get as many babies as possible. And the system becomes very capitalistic, very competitive, and the amount of coercion and bribery and kidnappings only increases. And I think that what a lot of people don't understand about adoption is that the vast majority of these children were not actually orphans. Most of them had living mothers, most of them had living families. And these children are coming from either single mothers or from families living in poverty. So instead of receiving support to keep families together, these agencies are coming in and taking the children instead. And American families and other European families are paying very, very hefty fees by this point. And so what the committee is looking at now is how this system happened, how it elevated to the heights where the Korean government has labeled it as child trafficking. And I think a lot of adopted people and activists are wondering now too, how do we bring this all out into the light? There's a massive call for transparency from these agents for a release of records. And they feel that the only way that we can achieve some sort of justice is by opening up all of the records that are still remain confidential today.
Paige, we've got about 5 minutes left. There are adult Korean adoptees living all over Iowa now, across the country, many listening to this podcast or broadcast, undoubtedly. And if, they wanted to get in touch with you, we'd be glad to pass on an email sent to rivertoriver@iowapublicradio.org. What would you want them, those directly affected in Iowa, in the Midwest, in this country, what would you want them to take from this book, and where can they turn if they want to look into their own records?
So when I set out to write this book, I wanted to uncover who the Holts really were and what their motivations really were, because there still remains this very sanitized, very positive idea of not only Bertha and Harry Holt and the Holt Agency, but the intercountry adoption industry at large. And so if a Korean adopted person is to pick up my book, I hope what they get out of it is that I've done the work of putting together the puzzle pieces of how this couple with no child welfare experience developed this deeply radical, unorthodox agency and really exploded intercountry adoption, not only in Korea, but then expanded that model to other post-war, post-colonial countries across the world. And I want to quickly say I could only do that because of the research that's been done before me, mostly by Korean American academics or Korean adopted people. But I was using a lot of their work. That was the basis of where I could start and then go in and really get into the weeds of things. By the time I got to the Sueppels, I was very careful because, of course, adopted people are not some homogenous group. Of course, the Sueppel story is not, if this is not the norm. And I don't want to speak on behalf of any adopted person. That is absolutely not my role. But I did want to challenge the narrative within the white community about the way that adoption was perceived even by the late 90s, early 2000s. I wanted to challenge the fact that, why these four children were even sent to Iowa to begin with. They all four children, all four Sueppel children, had living mothers back home. And so for me, it was about just coming in as a journalist and compiling as many facts as possible that I could, just to say, like, here are the receipts. And I hope if this book does anything, I hope that it's ultimately about the danger of turning complicated human suffering into a clean moral narrative. Once something becomes framed as rescue or salvation or humanitarian good, it can become very difficult to question the systems beneath it, even when those systems are causing profound harm.
Paige, I want to thank you very much for this conversation and for this work in your book, What They Stole. Just reading it left me with such a heavy feeling, a feeling of import and significance. You spent 6 years with this material. How did it change you? What do you carry now with you that you didn't before?
Well, going through this, I started the research of this book in late 2019, and shortly after I became pregnant, I had a child. When I sat down to actually write this book, it took me about a year and a half to write it. I was raising a young child. It made me question a lot of the systems around childcare. But I had not, I, I'll admit that I did not understand the intercountry adoption industry at all. I also carried some of these preconceptions before I sat down and started digging in. It also made me look domestically at adoption and question what families are being separated and why, who has the privilege of adopting a child and why. Why do we always see white adoptive families adopting children of color, but not the reverse? What systems of support can prevent family separation? And I also started looking at family policing and who's under the lens of the government in the US and who's not. So it's once you read it, I think it start reading into adoption, it just starts leading to a lot more questions.
Paige Towers, thank you so much for this conversation. What They Stole, the title of Paige's book. Thank you, Paige.
Thank you so much for having me.
Today's program produced by Caitlin Troutman. I'm Ben Kiefer. Thanks for joining us.